So we're talking to Steve Hall, publisher of Ad Rants, a very popular marketing and advertising blog for the advertising industry, sort of a irreverent look at marketing and advertising. Tell us a little bit about the site and what makes it different from other blogs out there.
Well, we do report news, but we do it with a little bit of wit and humor and snark, I guess, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's not like the industry needs another news site. I mean, there's two very good ones out there. No one's ever going to replace them. And, so we try to look at critique the creative with a little bit of a different angle to it, I suppose, and maybe sort of call out some of the industry's mistakes maybe a little bit more forcefully than mainstream media might do, and maybe poke fun, call some names along the way, but not out to really harm anybody, but just to have some fun. It's kind of an alternative, to something to read when you're feeling bad,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you do have a sort of a mainstream like publishing background. You've done a lot of that stuff. You've been in ad agencies. You've been kind of around this world, and you kind of decided to do this blog full time. I mean, this is your main gig. It's not a side project for you. So talk a little bit about why you chose to do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I really fell into it. I mean, like you said, my previous career was entirely on the agency side, in media, in account service, in new business, and then, anyone who's worked in an agency knows that you get laid off here and there, and I got laid off, and I was out of work, and it was around 2000 or 2001, and, this blogging thing had just started, and I was checking into it, and I thought, well, I'm out of work. I got to stay clued into what's going on in the industry, so I thought I'd read about the industry and then sort of write my take on it on the blog, and also just check out the whole culture of the blog, that kind of thing. And so I did that for a while, never thinking that it was ever going to be a business. And I went back to work, and for another couple of years, and I kept the blog going on the side, and never ever thinking it was going to ever be a business. And then got laid off again. And at that time, the blog had been around for a couple of years. The readership was up. I had advertisers, and I thought, hey, there's a business here, And I'm not the entrepreneurial type, so I never really would have thought that this would be something that I would do. So it just went from there. I mean, it just took off, And maybe I had first mover advantage because, I don't know. It just happened to work.
Well, one of the big reasons I read it religiously is because it does kind of break news about campaigns and new campaigns. I mean, maybe somebody else is talking about it, but there's a lot of here's what people have just launched, but it includes your take on it. And I read it as much for knowing what's out there as I read it for seeing what you have to say about it. And so I really see it as your personality and the way that you talk about these campaigns is intertwined with the site. And so talk a little bit about how important that's been to be you and do this site.
There is a voice, and there's two voices now. I mean, I have a co-editor, Angela Natividad, so there's two of us, and there's two different voices. But I mean, there's two different, but they're similar. They're both in the same vein of how we comment on the advertising industry. But you're right. I mean, people are sort of like, not to be pompous or anything, but they're sort of like, oh, what's Steve Hall going to say about this? Kind of a thing. That's
kind of like the Bob Garfield of blogging.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Bob has his following, and I have my following. Everyone's got their following, so. I mean, it's nice to know that people actually care what I think. I mean, who knew? It's kind of nice, And I suppose because I worked in the industry long enough, in some respects, I should know what I'm talking about. I don't always know that I am, but I try.
Now, you've managed to build a really successful blog, and a lot of companies, when they start to think about blogging or they start to think about using social media, one of the really tough things for them is dealing with the corporate voice versus the individual voice. And I mean, obviously it's you and it's Angela, and you each have your different voices, and you're kind of talking about campaigns, but it is still a very human voice. Like, I know when Angela's writing something, I get how she writes it, and I know how you write it, and that's something that a lot of companies struggle with. And so what advice would you give to some of the companies that are sort of in that position, that want to use a blog for marketing or want to use social media but struggle with allowing that kind of voice or finding that kind of voice?
It's a big problem because, since time began, corporations have always been about having one voice, and it's controlled, and there is only one way to say it, and there's only one way to respond to any sort of negativity in the industry about a particular company, and so suddenly that's been completely turned on its head. Everyone has the power to say anything they want about any company. And at first, companies really just sort of said, oh no, oh my God, cease and desist, call up the lawyers, and for a couple of years there was that, and of course that was just sort of, the bloggers laughed at that, some people, I don't think anybody actually got sued, but certainly a company has every right to control, which is maybe an over-powerful word, but to manage what their company represents in the public. But in the past 2 years, companies have really realized that, there is this thing called the conversation, and they should sort of join it, and they should sort of discuss. And you can learn a lot, too, by what's being said about a brand online. Because, way back, it was just, here's our position, here's our ad campaign, boom, it runs, it's done. And yeah, someone might have done a post analysis to see what happened, but for the most part, it's like, good, we're done. That campaign was a success, because no one could comment back. Now, there are a million different ways for consumers to talk back to brands.
Yep, that's right. So, one of the last questions is who's really doing it right? Who's worth ranting about in a good way, I guess.
Who's worth ranting about in a good way? Well, in some respects, Dell, who did not at all do it right in the beginning, but now they've got Richard Adele on Twitter, and I've seen many other brands. GM actually a long time ago launched blogs, and had a lot of their top management publishing on the blog. So they, here's GM, this giant corporation, which you would think would ever actually engage in something like that. Ford went out and hired Scott Monty, who's their social media strategist. Not sure what his true title is, but he's the guy who's supposed to represent Ford in the world of social media.
Right.
So you've got big brands really recognizing this, and so there's a few that are doing it right. There's actually a lot more that are doing it right than are doing it wrong, and that's actually encouraging, and in some respects depressing, because there's fewer and fewer people that I can make fun of.
Yeah, no, one of the things I remember you told me early on when we first met was that you're not as snarky as you blog.
In real life, right?
In real
yes.
life, and
yes.
in real life, I want people to know as a closing thing, you're actually a very nice guy and
Thank
not
you.
scary at all.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Steve.
All right, you're welcome.